All right. As Audrey mentioned, my name is Bethany Quinn. I am Executive Vice President of Golden Shovel, and I lead our thought leadership efforts to present to our clients and the overall community information on topics that are relevant to economic development. And one of the things that we have seen that's really become more of a common occurrence lately is just changes within economic development organizations. Sometimes the changes are because economic developers are going to a different community, and other times it is due to retirement. But either way, there is something that's definitely common, and that is change. Change is happening. So, what we want to do is talk about succession planning for economic development organizations, community organizations, and how some of these same principles are going to apply to any succession planning work you're doing with businesses in your community. So we're going to cover knowing when it's time to go, steps to create a succession plan, how to safeguard your mission, identifying potential leaders and developing their skills, common best practices, and financial management during the transition. And of course, there are resources in this webinar and some of the follow-ups that Audrey will send to you as well that you can utilize. So some of you may have seen this announcement recently, but I thought his quote on knowing when it's time to go was actually pretty spot on.
But my intensity is the same. I think when I don't have that kind of intensity, I should leave. I don't think CEOs should retire in place and just cut back and take it easy for a while. I think that erodes the whole company over time. I think that's a mistake. I think the management team has tons of intensity. I can't do this forever.
And that's the point. Really, it's important to know when maybe that intensity is starting to fade a little bit, right? So the importance is having a succession plan because no one's going to stay in their job forever. And if that plan is in place and it seems like it's time to move on, then the organization is going to sustain. And I think that this video kind of explains it pretty well.
I'm a big fan of retiring as soon as you can do it. In economics, there's something called the law of diminishing returns. It basically says that the more you do something, the less value you get from it. Understanding it is the reason why I think you should retire as early as possible. Let me explain. Imagine that pizza is your favorite food. Might not be too hard to imagine for some of you. It's also fascinating to me how often I manage to talk about pizza on a financial YouTube channel, but that's a whole other thing. Back to the story. Imagine that pizza is your favorite food. If you got it once a week, you'd probably never get tired of it. But what if pizza was the only thing that you had to eat? After a month or two, you'd get really sick of it. The more you had of it, the less value you received from eating it. That's a roundabout way of explaining what the law of diminishing returns is. It's a fancier way of teaching us what all of our grandmas used to teach us. Too much of a good thing isn't actually a good thing at all.
Yeah, so it's a really good way to sum it up. Just the fact that no matter
I'm a
how
big
passionate you
fan of
are and how much
retiring.
you love what you do, there is going to come a point where that passion is no longer quite as high, and it might be time to move on and do something different. The question then becomes, is the next generation ready to lead? And does the organization have a plan for when you do make that transition? One of the things that we would love for you guys to do is to take a short survey. Audrey, you want to talk about that in the chat, I think?
Yep, I just added a link to the survey. So if everyone could go and click that, either take it now, it's a super quick survey as you're listening in the background or right after the webinar. We'd really appreciate it.
Thanks, Audrey. So this is just a multiple choice question survey to help us get a better understanding of where people sit in regards to their plans individually and their organization. So let's talk about it. Once you know that it's time to go, or maybe you're in advance and you know that's going to happen eventually, what steps do you take to create a succession plan? So we recommend starting with identifying the key roles that need to be filled, documenting the responsibilities and duties of each role, describing the core skills and competencies required to fulfill it, what training needs to be implemented in order to make sure those core skills exist, and if there's any internal team members with the interest and aptitude to advance. We'll go through those more in detail. So it's important, like I said, to identify the key roles. And It's a mistake to think that this is just at the executive director level, especially if there's an opportunity to promote somebody internally. That is going to create gaps in the next level of leadership. So making sure that there is a pathway for what happens if anyone in the organization were to leave or be promoted is definitely a good idea. In addition, it's important to consider the board of directors. So as economic development directors know, there is a situation where if the board is new, there could be some challenges in regards to sharing of historic knowledge and making sure that they feel very comfortable in their role. So that's something that even if you are new to your organization and plan on staying there for a long time, you may want to start working on a succession plan for what happens if some of your older board members do decide to step away. And what is that transition going to look like? When you're doing that, it's important to identify for each role what the short-term and long-term objectives are, what their role is in maintaining organizational culture, what their daily activities are, and how they're involved in external and internal communication. It's also important to look at the skills they're going to need for each one of those roles. So education, this is a really interesting one. I have worked in the industry for almost 9 years. I don't know if you guys know this that are here on our webinar today, but I also host our podcast. And so I get to interview economic developers about their background, which is really fun. And I don't think I've ever met one that has said, yes, I when I graduated high school and went into college, I knew I was going to be an economic developer and my degree path was economic development all the way. That's not normally how it happens. Some people will get education in skills that are adjacent to economic development, but not usually in economic development specifically. So it's important to evaluate what those actual requirements are. One of the mistakes that sometimes is made is assuming that somebody has to have a specific certificate or degree in economic development, for example, where in reality there may be adjacent educational experience, certificates, or courses that provide some of those core skills that you need. And that applies to technical knowledge and skills as well. Interpersonal skills, work experience, leadership skills, and background knowledge. What do you actually need in someone that is filling this role? I know in an interview I conducted recently with someone who's been an economic development leader for 30 years, and he mentioned that he's looking at people who have chamber experience and business leadership experience, for example, because a lot of those adjacent skills and qualifications apply really well to economic development. So this is a tool, and again, we're linking this, and you'll get this in a resource that was developed by another organization, Sigma Succession, that I think can be very useful. And this is their success profile worksheet. So you can see here, it's a really great way to guide you through this process because you're going to describe the position demographics, the criteria, literally breaking down the education, experience, knowledge, skills, everything that they need for this particular position. And then you're going to build out what those competencies are that fit into each one of those buckets. This is a free tool. It's available to download on their website and definitely useful when you're completing the planning process. Also, I like here at the top, you see this little area for urgency. It's good to help identify which positions you think are going to need to be filled more quickly. And then one of the things that is really important to consider internally is, again, the training needed to develop core skills and competencies, because you might not be able to find someone who has all of them. That's becoming more and more rare. And if you don't, then you're going to have a training budget. And it's important to determine if the training can be delivered in-house or if it's going to be off-site through a program or organization, and how long it's going to take for training to be completed. Now, if you cannot afford as an organization to hire someone who doesn't have those skills from day one, you may want to think more strongly about identifying a successor earlier from within the organization and put them on that training path while you are still there. All right, so let's talk about safeguarding your mission before and during a transition. So this is just as important as skills. A new leader that's hired for any organization has to understand the organization's mission and needs to truly embrace it and feel passionate about achieving it, and be someone who's going to take responsibility for outcomes and share leadership and encourage team members to play an active role. So in our conversations with economic development professionals, there is a pretty strong commonality when people aren't staying in organizations very long, and it's just that there wasn't a cultural fit. Maybe the mission of the organization was not a fit, or there was something where there just wasn't a connection between what the leader's vision was and maybe what the board's was. And so it's really important to explore that and make sure there's a match before somebody takes on a leadership role in a new organization. And whenever possible, we like to give examples of people who have done this really well. So the Align team is a great example. I know Audrey's actually publishing an article on their succession planning success, so to speak. So the Align team works with nonprofit and economic development organizations. I'm not exactly sure how many they have as clients right now, but they provide that executive level leadership and strategic planning. One of their clients, for example, is WIDA, the Wyoming Economic Development Association, who is also one of Golden Shovel's clients. And what was interesting about the Align team is they do provide this strategic support for organizations who are going through transitions, and definitely a great resource if anyone wants to contact them. But when they went through their own succession planning process, even though they have the internal expertise, they took their own advice and they hired an outside expert. And the reason they did that is because it's really important to have someone who isn't biased. You can see this quote from President Brittany Ashby. And she said, "We always recommend bringing in a third party to facilitate group sessions and generate the succession plan, someone without a bias. They helped us to identify that we needed plans for the next level of leadership." So that was one of the things I mentioned earlier, the importance of knowing if one person steps up, what's going to happen to those roles that need to be now replaced. And so one of the tips that they recommend is that it's really important to engage your board, invite team members to participate, to go off site to reduce distractions, and be open-minded to the feedback that is received by team members during these planning sessions. Again, their succession went very well, and they really credit a lot of that to the fact that they were inclusive and invited everyone in their team to participate, and were able to be led by that outside third party. Retaining institutional knowledge is also critical for any type of succession work. We have a quote here from Renee Smith of the city of Cheyenne, who said that before I worked for the city, I was the director of institutional advancement at a community college in Arizona. I reported to the college president, and he said early on that I needed to create a Mack truck binder. If I got hit by a Mack truck, someone could step in and do my job. So one of the things to consider is how would you pass on your institutional knowledge? Now, if you are a director and you have people working under you, my guess is you probably had some transition in the last couple of years, because it's just really common right now. And so it's not just about you having that binder or that way to pass out institutional knowledge of what you do, but every single person on your team should also be able to put that together. So if they left suddenly, you would be able to hand it off to the next person that you hire. So it's really important to carve out the time within your organization to prepare and get that done. I will tell you that some of our best practices internally is to not just have written documentation, but also video documentation whenever possible, just because people learn differently, and it's important to share information in multiple ways. So that might even be putting your Zoom on and recording your screen, or having a team member do it if there's specific tasks they're involved in, and actually talking through what they do. So using multimedia tools, always a great idea. Another best practice for retaining institutional knowledge really was demonstrated by Washington County, Minnesota, and their process. So we spoke with Rick Roy, who is their Workforce and Veterans Services Division Manager. And he told us that they really take what he calls a bit-by-bit approach in Washington County. So instead of having someone retire or leave and then filling the position that's vacant, they actually try to identify the person who is taking on the new role in 6 months or more before the person actually leaves. And what they will do is they will have that person come into the organization, start being trained, and then slowly take over responsibilities from the person that's leaving. Now, if somebody's leaving because they have a different opportunity, that might not work. But if somebody's leaving due to retirement, or they just plan for whatever personal reason to step down, this is definitely something that's worth considering. If even in organizations where maybe you don't have a huge budget, if you're promoting from within, it could be as simple as really making sure that person that you're promoting starts taking on tasks one at a time, so they can become accustomed to what the person does, and make sure that any of that institutional knowledge that might be a relationship piece or a way of communicating or a tool that maybe you don't think about but's really important gets passed on. It doesn't get lost during the transition. And speaking of internal leaders, I really liked this article that was in the International Journal of Managerial Studies and Research. It's linked here if anyone wants to read it later on, where Jane Sayambi wrote, during times of transition, strategic leadership success planning provides an organization with a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to retain its best and brightest employees, leaders, and talent. So I always encourage economic development leaders to consider what internal team members they're working with that have the aptitude to advance and really feel passionate about the organization, and to make sure that they are considered when the opportunities arise. All right, so here's another free tool and resource for you, also from Sigma Succession. So this succession bench worksheet is great because it allows you to classify roles, right? What types of roles are we dealing with? How quickly might somebody need to advance into them? And this helps you to identify potential internal candidates and what is their progression in the organization. There may be somebody that you feel like is a great cultural fit, has a lot of enthusiasm, but they're new and there's no way they're ready for leadership. But what is their next step, right? Maybe they're at level C right now and there's no way they can take on a top position, but there might be something in between. So this worksheet, I highly recommend everyone to download and play with it, and really create this for every single team member to think about where they could go. And it lets you list out their current position, what the next position would be, and what readiness skill they would need in order to continue to move up. So great planning tool. And these are free on their website. So gotta love that. All right. I mentioned the economic developer I interviewed about this, Ron Tillery. He's with Phelps County Development Corporation, for those who know Ron. And he talked about when he's looking at succession, he wants someone with an entrepreneurial mindset. So again, these core skills, these competencies might not be just technical skills. They may be the way that someone looks at the world, the way they're going to interact with the community. And when you're evaluating internal employees, these are similar things that you have to look at, right? Maybe someone has those technical skills, but they don't have an entrepreneurial mindset yet, or they're not really good at strategic planning or engaging the community. So using that worksheet to identify what they need to develop in order to move up to that next level is a great resource. Also, of course, the encouragement to look outside the walls of economic development when you're hiring, because there may be people who have experience with nonprofits or real estate and development, for example, that could be a great fit for your organization. Now, when it comes to transitions, there's a couple of tips to consider. We've talked about this several times, but preparing for multiple levels of transitions is important. For one, even if you don't promote from within, not everyone will stay. Golden Shovel has over 290 clients. I will say it's very, very common that if someone internally applies for a top position and doesn't get it, that they then leave, usually within a couple of months. And that can be difficult for a new director because they're new to the organization. If there isn't a plan for how to replace that next level or lower level person, it's just one more challenge they have to overcome, and potentially without the current leader's guidance. So making sure you prepare for multiple levels of transitions ensures the organization will have that continuity and sustain even if multiple people turn over. Also important to train board of directors so they can guide new team members. We are seeing as executive searches take longer and longer, a lot of board members are stepping into the executive director position, at least temporarily. I think it's wise for any board to be able to have the skills to do that. So consider again how you can train your board to take over and making sure that those resources are in place in case there's ever a situation where they need to. You know, and transitions don't always have to be so drastic as somebody moving on. It could be the reality that we're human and anyone can get sick. And if there's a prolonged illness, who's going to take over during that time? So this is a good way to form a contingency plan regardless. Also, identify people who can be a resource. If there is a new leader stepping into an organization, where are they supposed to go for help? You may provide all the resources in the world, but there still may be questions they need answered. Who has that institutional knowledge within the greater community, and why should they contact them? So kind of creating that cheat sheet of contacts and resources is wise. And of course, ensuring the organization is financially stable and can afford to spend on recruitment, so executive search, on training, and pay market rate salaries is really important to maintain organization continuity after a leader decides to step down. And so this is where we're really looking at preparing for long-term success. So one of the first things you have to do overall is, what's the clarity of mission? Knowing your organization's why and what steps are necessary to make a positive impact, because it has to be conveyed to anyone new who is considering taking on a leadership role. And you have to have the financial backing necessary to implement the mission-centric programming that's been put in place because of the mission. And then the talent to be able to do the work. So for economic developers who really want to make sure their organization sustains long after they're gone, these are really those 3 pillars that you need to make sure are in place. All right, and speaking of financial stability and long-term viability, as many of you know, we work very closely with Convergent Nonprofit Solutions. They're a partner of ours who really focuses on making sure that organizations are financially stable and able to grow and really achieve their missions. So some of their recommendations really come from the work they've done in raising significant sums of money for organizations throughout the country. And they recommend that long tenured leaders who are nearing their transition or retirement really look for ways to leave their organization in a positive position by proactively planning for revenue stability through the transition period. And that's where their approach to a multi-year campaign can be very useful. Because if the organization relies on an annual fundraising scheme, that can be difficult because the new director is going to have to come in and try to reach out to those relationships immediately. And it might be a little bit challenging to become acclimated in their role and also have to be responsible for raising the money necessary to fund their position in year 1. A multi-year campaign takes away some of that risk because commitments are established for a prolonged period of time. And it's also necessary to do that because attracting a new leader is easier if the organization has a war chest of funds in place. Now, if you're not sure if your organization can support a transition and pay for an executive search and raise the money necessary to maybe have you there as a consultant and a new leader at the same time, a feasibility study is a good way to go to see if the organization can support that type of campaign. So why do you really need a war chest? It's important to hire a recruiting firm to conduct the executive search. Next Move Group, many of you are familiar with, that's definitely someone that we recommend. It takes time. There's only so many trained economic developers, and there's a lot of people retiring. So funding someone to provide that assistance is going to increase the outcomes, make it more likely that the next director is hired in an expeditious manner and not prolonged delay. That's really going to be important for your board, especially if your board has to fill the gaps in between. You need to pay for relocation expenses, market rate salaries, and fund operations and ongoing campaigns that are already established, while also making sure that the new director's priorities can be funded. Because it is so competitive right now, people are getting multiple offers and they have options. Going into a community where you may have great ideas but no money to implement, is going to make it less likely that a new director is going to stay for the long term. So again, just some recommendations on how to secure that funding. A multi-year campaign obviously provides the most stability. Growing your organization's member and investor base ahead of time before a transition can be wise. I know we spoke with multiple organizations leading up to the creation of this white paper, and that was a strategy several were implementing. Securing grants to fund strategic initiatives and the staff to run them ahead of time. Then partnering with city or county to provide economic development services on their behalf using some of their capital. So that way there is a guaranteed revenue source. That's something we're seeing more commonly as well. And of course, what are the benefits of doing all of this? Jessica Gilder gave us this quote. She said, in the past year, I've taken the lead on childcare initiatives with my boss's support. He guides from a distance, but is close enough to help. And I appreciate that we have strong leaders and a board working together to make sure we have a succession plan in place. She said that about the fact that she was hired knowing that her boss was going to be retiring. So again, it just made the transition easier and helped her to get acclimated to the organization. I already mentioned the Align team success. Just to reiterate what they said is that, you know, their motto is one goal, one team, and they live that by involving everyone in the succession planning process. And because of that, they only lost a couple people along the way, but the majority of the team has stayed, has bought in, and their company is growing. So definitely encouraging to see those results. All right, and before we go, we want to provide you with some additional resources for your use and consideration. Already mentioned Convergent being one of our partners. They are actually going to have a succession planning webinar that is specific to how to raise capital ahead of that succession plan, ahead of a transition. And that is definitely a hugely important aspect to what you need to do. I recommend registering for that free webinar so that you can learn more about their process and recommendations. As you can see, they raise usually 110% against goal. So they definitely have the success to back up what they say. And on that webinar, you are also going to hear about case studies and best practices. You can learn more about their work in action and why it's important to raise money ahead of a transition. And there's a webinar registration link right here that you'll get with these resources. Another resource I wanted to leave you with today is the succession planning checklist. So this is pretty comprehensive. I recommend printing it out, going through it with your team and with your board. And this covers everything from process to communication to the documentation we discussed, to accountability and who is responsible for what. So basically a complete overview of everything that you need to do and a pretty easy guide to work from. And there's a link, of course, for you to download that. And then when it comes to succession planning for economic development organizations, everything that we've discussed also applies to businesses. And anyone who's doing BR&E work in their community knows how critically important it is right now to help business owners prepare for succession, especially in rural communities where if that business closed, it might not open up again. So really important to know what their plans are ahead of time. For this, I recommend the University of Minnesota. Their extension office has an entire program that's dedicated to succession planning. Fantastic resource. They have done original research where they have engaged with the business community to find out what people care about when they're looking to retire and sell their business potentially. They have a list of resources that can be printed. They have videos that you can watch, entire guides. They've even made the survey they gave out to business owners available for free if you wanted to survey yours. You really cannot find, in my opinion, a more comprehensive set of resources than what they have gathered for you. So yeah, anyone engaged in BR&E right now, this is where I would direct you for a complete guide to how to help your local businesses succeed in that transition. All right, and Audrey, why don't you talk about the white paper?
Yeah, so we're putting on the finishing touches of this white paper that Bethany has mentioned a couple of times. So you can go to this link to pre-download it. So you'll just fill out the form at the bottom and you'll be the first to receive it as soon as we have it ready. We're hoping not too much longer here within the next week or two is ideal. But if you fill out that form, you'll be the first to get that email with the resource. So definitely go and check that out. And then we'll also be releasing a series of articles that'll be related to succession planning over the next several months. So you can subscribe to the newsletter and get them there, or you can go to our news page on the Golden Shovel Agency website. And I mean, we've got tons of articles about everything, so you can search by keywords or any specific words you like to look up. Succession planning can be one of those. So thank you so much, Bethany. Thank you everyone for joining. It looks like we are ending a little bit soon, so you get a little bit of extra time in your day to do what you'd like. But be on the lookout for this follow-up email.
Thank you, Audrey, and thank you everyone for attending today. As Audrey mentioned, the white paper is even more in depth, but definitely when she sends this follow-up, take a look and access those free resources we mentioned today. We'll talk to you soon.